Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to episode 26 of the podcast, where we're going to be discussing the Nancy Drew book, The Mystery of the Tolling Bell. I do want to preface this episode with a little bit of a content warning. As I stated at the end of last week's episode, this book heavily deals with people who have dwarfism, and they're not always depicted in the best light, which I am going to go ahead and apologize for that, even though I'm not the one that wrote the book. There are some unfortunate stereotypes that we deal with in this book. Also, I've tried to do my research in preparing for this episode, and from what I can tell, most people who have dwarfism and are in that community prefer to be called little people. I know that probably isn't across the board, but for the sake of this episode, that is what we are going to call people of shorter stature. So this book is the 23rd in the Nancy Drew series and was written in 1946. And we've got 3 different covers for the Mystery of the Tolling Bell that we're looking at today. And if you ever want to see these covers before the podcast episode airs, they're always on my Instagram the day before, which is True Drew Podcast. So the first of these covers actually really does evoke a lot of the 1940s for me because Nancy's hairstyle is very curled. She's wearing like a pleated blue skirt and matching shirt. She's actually got her purse. I love that she went into this cave and she was just like, I'm going to accessorize. I might be solving a mystery, but I cannot leave my purse behind. Love it. On this cover, we can also see a man in a white hooded robe. It kind of reminds me of Secret of Redgate Farm, but there's also a man rowing a rowboat either into or out of the cave. This may be the scene where she got left behind by someone. We'll get to that in a second, but this cover is pretty cool. Now, on the second edition of this cover, I've never actually seen one of these in person. I had to look this up on Google, but Nancy has the red hair that we know from the 60s and 70s covers. It's flipped out at the ends. She's wearing a pink shirt over what looks like either a red dress or a red skirt. I don't know. It's an interesting ensemble for cave spelunking, but she's got a flashlight, and again, we see this white hooded figure. They're kind of sitting on the ledge, just sort of chilling out and being generally spooky, and there's a person in a rowboat kind of coming in, so it's similar to the first cover. And the third and final edition of this cover has, you guessed it, Nancy's disembodied head and half of her torso, but she is kind of in this cave cutout looking thing, and we have the silhouette of the person in the robe. They've got the creepy little bell that they ring when the tide comes in and out, and another person, in a rowboat. So they're all very similar yet different. I don't know. They're interesting covers. So I gave these book covers a rating of 4 magnifying glasses because they're pretty interesting. I generally like the covers that show some action. If it's just Nancy's head floating around with other objects, or if it doesn't really, depict the story well, I kind of tend to give those covers a lower rating. And as always, I like to come up with a funny cover spoof for these covers because sometimes they're just hilarious. But for this one, I just said, row, row, row your boat, y'all. Because, I don't know, we've talked about this so many times in this podcast. Nancy just doesn't have good experience with boats. And, of course, there's going to be a lot of boat mishaps in this book. Yeah, I just checked my little tally sheet that I've started of just all the mishaps that happened to Nancy. It includes really weird stuff like being trapped inside a statue versus her getting almost run down by a car. And as far as boat accidents go, we're up to 9 boat accidents, and we're only on the 23rd book, so I'm just saying. Now, I'm going to read off a couple of the characters that are in this book. There is a Miss John Chantry, and she's the woman that we are trying to solve this mystery for. There's June Barber, who's just a friend of Miss John Chantry's. Amos Hendrick. There is a Harry Tyrox, who is a perfume swindler. Mother Mathilda, I believe. I sound like I have a lisp. Mathilda. That's how it was spelled in the book. And she's a candle maker. There's Madame, or Martha Stott, and Grumper. Yes, there is a legitimate person named Grumper, or that is his nickname, and we'll get back to that in a second. So without further ado, here is the synopsis that I came up with for The Mystery of the Tolling Bell. Nancy, Bess, and George set off to meet Carson Drew, who is working on a case in Candleton for a Miss John Chantry, who owns a tea room there. Nancy and the girls encounter a snake oil cosmetic saleswoman, and Bess buys some perfume. A horse-drawn cart goes rogue down the street, and Nancy pushes the woman's cosmetic cart out of the way, only to be accused by a local woman of cheating her daughter out of money. After the mix-up is cleared up, the girls go to the Sauce and D tea room and help by waitressing, and Nancy encounters a man, Amos Hendrick, saying he's looking for a Paul Revere bell. He drops a paper saying one of the many bells contains jewels. In the meantime, Nancy is beginning to worry because her father hasn't shown up, but she, Bess, and George go to explore Bald Head Cave, which is said to be haunted by the sound of a bell that rings out just before water gushes from the cave. They all become separated, and Nancy has a weird hallucination that elves are carrying her. Ned ends up finding Nancy and taking her back to Miss Chantry's, where she gets a call saying her father is at Fisher's Cove Hotel, only for George to pick up a call a few minutes later where someone says not to let Nancy go to the hotel. Nancy naturally goes and finds her dad. He returns with her to Miss Chantry's, and the next day the girls go to Bald Head Cave with Amos Hendrick, who wants to look for the bell, but something spooks him, and he leaves them stranded. Meanwhile, when the girls finally get back to town, Nancy learns of a connection in her case, her father's, and Moncoeur Perfume Company, which is conning Miss Chantry out of money. Madam is soon captured, and Nancy and George go to explore the cottage they found and encounter a little person named Franz. They tackle him, and Ned shows up and takes him to the police. Nancy finds the perfume factory through a secret door under the cottage. Then she almost drowns when high tide comes in. Ned saves her while wearing a gas mask. The bad guys are captured, and Nancy finds the bell. The end. Okay, so this book is wild, and I mispronounced that. It's Moncoeur. Moncoeur? I'm so bad at pronouncing things in French, but it basically means my love, my heart, and that is the name of this fake or scammy perfume company. Now, I came up with a newspaper headline synopsis that kind of just sums up what we just read, but the one that I came up with is Fraud Perfume Business Busted by a Local Detective. So this is a crazy book. I hope you guys are ready, because I took down a lot of notes and direct quotes because there's just so much in this book that's so out there. So the first note that I took down is we're only on page 1 and George is fat shaming Bess. I was like, this has got to be a record, George. Like, usually you wait at least until chapter 3. But no, she's just being all mean to Bess. And I'm just like, so the girl wants to eat lobster on vacation. Like, sue her. Like, I would like to do that. You're just rude, George, okay? You're just rude. I take back everything that I said about feeling sorry for you and your clothes going missing in the last book. So, you're just mean. Now, this next note that I took down is actually a direct quote, and I thought this was one of the best things that I've seen so far in any of the books that really just sums up Nancy Drew and what she is. And so the quote says, Nancy's young life had been crammed with adventure. Daughter of an eminent criminal lawyer, she was unusually sensible, clever, and talented. Like, I couldn't have said that better myself. Like, this makes me want to really read these books. I mean, I always like to read these books anyway, but that was a great description. So the next thing that I wrote down is Bess is interested in some cosmetics from that company, Moncoeur, and this woman's selling them out of a cart, and nothing good will come from this. That's what I wrote down. I was like, remember the blue jade from Secret of Redgate Farm? Bess bought it, and then she spilled it all over Nancy on the train, and then this guy comes up to her and just starts asking her questions about some secret operation. And naturally, nothing good comes of this. And right after Bess buys this perfume, a horse pulling a cart runs down the street, and Nancy risks her life to push the cosmetics cart out of the way. Like, bravo, Nancy, you saved all this scam artist's perfume so they can continue to scam people and sell it to people. And I guess she saved the horse that was running at it. But usually there's a small child involved, and that's usually who Nancy jumps in to save. But I was just like, not a smart move. So then, as if that's not bad enough, Nancy pushes the cart out of the way, and this woman comes up to her and is accusing her, and she says, you robbed our daughter, and what's worse, you encouraged her to paint herself up like, and I'm sorry, an Indian warrior. I read that, and I was like, oh my gosh. Like, okay, so it doesn't get any better from here, folks. Now on to a little less controversial note that I took down. Miss Chantry owns the Sauce and D shop. And I thought this was a play on salt and sea or something, but it's a play on the words salad and sandwich. Sauce and D shop. I was like, okay. But the way Nancy, Bess, and George act, you would think that it's like this genius name. They just go on about it for like a paragraph. But apparently this place sells a dandy tart, and prepare yourself. It is filled with steaming hot fish pudding topped with salmon-colored meringue. That is the absolute most disgusting thing I think I've ever heard of. Like if I was out at a restaurant and someone said, oh, you should try our signature dandy tart, I'd probably be real excited. I'd be like, oh, is that like a little cherry pie or something? And then when they're like, no, it's actually steaming hot fish pudding, I'd probably be like, no, that's disgusting. Don't put me down for the fish pudding. That's awful. But we do get an interesting little interlude where Nancy almost has a job again, because the last time that she did that was in the Whispering Statue. So Nancy, Bess, and George become waitresses here at the Sauce and D shop, and Nancy picks up a note a man dropped talking about Paul Revere Bells. And this guy is named Amos Hendrick, and let me tell you, he is very enthusiastic about these bells. That's all he wants to talk about is these Paul Revere bells. So the next note that I took down is Nancy, Bess, and George go to explore Bald Head Cave, and water rushes out at them after they hear a tolling bell. Bess manages to get herself inside the boat, but George and Nancy almost drown. And then this is where things get really weird. After they get separated, Nancy ends up high on the cliff and passes out. And then she has this dream, I kid you not, that she's being carried by brown elves. This is where the little people or people with dwarfism come into this story. But I was like reading this book and I thought, am I tripping out? What is happening here? But no, it's actually in this book and it is crazy. So Nancy comes back from her acid trip. Just kidding. There's some perfume fumes that come into play later on. But my next note says Nancy ends up meeting Ned on the road in her convertible. He just happens to be in town and he's selling insurance. Again, this man, he sells insurance quite a bit, but just the fact that he just happens to be in Candleton. We're not even in River Heights, we're in Candleton. I'm just picturing how that conversation went down, and Ned Nickerson is like, hey Nancy, what are you doing on the side of the road? I'm just out here selling insurance. And then Nancy's like, well, I just got carried away by some brown elves, and then I just woke up and I have no idea what's happening. Okay, this book is wild. It's up there with Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion. I need to make a list of just the craziest Nancy Drew books, and both of those books would make it on the list. Okay, so my next note is Nancy gets a phone call saying Carson is at a seedy hotel and is sick. Then she gets some calls and notes saying not to go there. And I thought that this was a ruse. I thought that Carson was going to be, not actually sick, but he really was there and he had been drugged by some people and they were holding him captive because they didn't want him to finish the case that he was working on. It was crazy. It was quite a twist. Also, the name of this hotel was Fisher's Cove Hotel, and that made me think of the Captain's Cove Hotel in the Haunted Carousel, her interactive computer game. That was kind of interesting because it was described as a seedy hotel, but the Captain's Cove was nice. Gotta love some fun days. Now, the next thing that I wrote down, Nancy, Bess, George, and Amos Hendrick go to explore Bald Head Cave, and George twists her ankle, and Amos just abandons them. He just leaves. He starts rowing off, and they're gonna drown. I mean, it's not cool of him to do that. But Nancy also finds a cottage with food still on the table and cobwebs like someone left really suddenly. That cottage will come back to play in just a little bit. Now, my next note says Nancy, Bess, and George go to a dance at a yacht club with Ned, John, a chemist friend of Ned's, and someone named Bill. What would Bert and Dave think? But John proves the Moncur products are mostly water and junk. So since he's a chemist, he takes some of the perfume that Bess bought and he analyzes it and he's like, this is basically just water. There's nothing in this. So Bess is naturally really sad about this because she feels like she was taken advantage of. Okay, so remember the woman earlier in the book who was yelling at Nancy and accusing her of ripping her daughter off because she thought that Nancy was the one selling the perfume products? Well, this girl's name is Minnie, and she encounters Nancy again at this point in the book, and she says she's working for Madam and pretending to look awful so she can be made up. So she's been working with this perfume sales lady, and their scheme is just, oh, I'll come here looking really awful and you'll fix me up with all the products or whatever. And so in her spare time, she wears all the makeup at once. I'm just picturing this poor girl with like blue eyeshadow and just like caked on makeup, and that's apparently what she looks like. I'm just picturing someone who went to Sephora and just like used all the sample products at once on their face. Now, the next note that I took down, I took a lot of notes for this one. A man tries to kidnap Nancy from Miss Chantry's and drops a package with bell labels on it, and Nancy and Ned tail the man's tire tracks and speak to a printer at the end of the trail who says he makes labels for Moncure and their new venture, Sweet Chimes. Do you see where this is going? Yeah? Yeah? Because there's a cave with a mysterious bell ringing noise, and their venture is called Sweet Chimes. How about that? So the next thing that I have down here in my notes is there are a lot of uncomfortable things about elves/dwarves. One man is named Grumper, and that was just so weird. They were definitely trying to play off of Grumpy from the Seven Dwarves, I guess, which is just, that's bad enough as it is. But I also noticed there's this weird stereotype of people with dwarfism also being chemists or alchemists. I don't know why. And I tried to look stuff up about this on Google and on the internet, and I couldn't find anything, but if you all have seen the first Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law, there's a whole plot point where there's this man with red hair, and he is of shorter stature, and he also just happens to be a chemist. And I don't know where this stereotype originated from, but it is very persistent. So the next thing that I have down is Nancy begins to think that she was drugged by fumes above Bald Head Cave. And to make sure it isn't just exertion, she tests this theory by running up and down the stairs 4 times. And Bess is just like, what are you doing, Nancy? And she's just like, I'm just making sure I'm still in peak stamina. So the next thing that I took note of is that as smart as Nancy is, she can't really figure out the concept of high and low tide for some reason in this book, because they go back to Bald Head Cave, I don't know, umpteen times. And they hear the bell, and they start to realize, Nancy's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should pay attention to what time it is, and then we'll figure out when the tides come up and down. It's like, yes, what a concept. It only took you until page 104 to figure this out. So, my next note just says, Nancy and George go into the abandoned cottage to explore it and are confronted by Franz, another little person who they tackle and tie up. Then Ned magically appears, and he takes the man to the police station. And Nancy explores the tunnels under the cottage and finds the cosmetic factory. But this whole scene was wild because Nancy and George sit on top of this man, Franz, and tie him up, and then Ned just busts into the cottage and is like, hey girls, you want me to take him to the police station? Where does he come from? I thought he was selling insurance. Ned Nickerson, everybody, man of international intrigue. So anyways, Ned takes Franz to the police station, and Nancy and George go about exploring the cosmetic factory underneath this cottage, and she gets trapped in there, and the tide's coming up. It's very dramatic, but Ned shows up in a gas mask. I'm like, how did he get to the police station so fast? I mean, it's got to be at least 30 minutes away, and then here he is in a gas mask. I'm glad he's there, because obviously Nancy would have drowned, but he's just kind of everywhere in this book and nowhere at the same time. So that's all my notes for The Mystery of the Tolling Bell, and I would normally do a segment of the podcast that I like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, but Hannah was not around for this book because we're in Candleton instead of River Heights, and the only mentioning of food we really get is the disgusting dandy tart of fish pudding. Oh, bring us some fishy pudding. No. Now, for the add that to your resume section of this episode, I said that Nancy could add cave spelunker to her resume because she goes around in the Bald Head Cave so many times. She almost drowns several times. She could still add that to her resume. And the second thing that Nancy could add to her resume is she was a waitress. Her, Bess, and George. It was kind of entertaining. Just trying to picture them serving up these dandy tarts on the East Coast. So, as for the things that I liked about the Mystery of the Tolling Bell, Nancy had a job, almost, again, which was kind of cool, because usually Nancy just seems to float around and not really have a job. I mean, Carson supports her, and she does get some cool gifts from her mystery adventures, but yeah. Oh, which while we're on the subject of this, so Nancy at the end of the book goes back to the cave, and she, on a hunch, looks in this hole in the wall, and she happens to find the Paul Revere Bell, which they theorize has been ringing when the tide comes in. The water pushes it and makes it ring. But she just decides, oh, I'm going to keep this for myself. And I was like, Nancy, like, do you have the authority to really do that? Like, yeah, you solved this mystery, but I think that the Paul Revere Bell belongs to the American people. That's just a little bit presumptuous of you to say that you're going to keep it. But anyway, as for the things I didn't like about the Mystery of the Tolling Bell, Ned showing up at the most random times. Like, it was appreciated. He saved Nancy's life quite a few times. But it was just so random. He just happens to be in Candleton, and he just happens to burst into the cottage, and then he's wearing that gas mask. It was just a lot. Another thing I didn't like was Amos Hendrick, the guy that left Nancy, Bess, and George stranded at the cave. I mean, this guy was obsessed with bells to the point where it was just like, are you okay? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, you value these bells over human life? I don't know. He was crazy. And the last thing that I didn't like about this book was the depiction of little people. It was just very derogatory. I mean, grumper. They describe him as just this grumpy man, and he is very rude when he goes to the restaurant where Nancy, Bess, and George are semi-working. And yeah, there were just so many bad descriptions, calling people like that elves and dwarves, and it was very uncomfortable to read. So I know you all are waiting for it, and you're wondering what my rating for this book would be. I have to give it a 1 magnifying glass, because while it was entertaining to read in parts, it was just such a weird book. So yeah, this is not one of my favorite Nancy Drew books. It's not one that I outright hate either, though, but it's just not a favorite of mine. So yeah, that concludes today's wrap-up for The Mystery of the Tolling Bell. For next week's episode, we're going to be doing one of the Her Interactive computer games, Secrets Can Kill. I hope you all will enjoy this one. I'm actually going to tackle the remaster because I currently can't get the original to work on my computer. And I may do a few comparisons between the original and the remastered, because the original came out in the late 90s. I think it was like 1997 or 98. It's like a true OG computer game. And the remaster came out sometime in the mid-2000s. So I hope you all will tune in for that episode, because I love discussing the games with you all. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.